Professor Williams.
Professor Williams.
Okay, so continuing on with our same series, we had the students ask questions regarding lecture, ran it through ChatGPT.
Great questions.
It was a good question this time. So the question this time, equally good, I think, is this idea of individualism versus the collective. Okay?
Yep.
And the lecture emphasizes, this is how the question reads, the lecture emphasizes that individuals are driven by self-interest, right? And how do you reconcile the inherent self-interest with the idea of representative democracy and collective decision-making? And again, this was generated by ChatGPT. And we've had some conversation back and forth real quick. And I wanted to kind of boil down what we had talked about to get to the heart of it, to keep these short.
Yeah.
Which was the objective. And so a couple of things. One, you work at the state legislature, right? So you deal with individuals who would contact you and have a problem.
Yep.
And you have to reconcile the individual's interest versus the whole district and what the district might want.
Yep, that's true.
Okay. And so let's say if somebody called up and let's say that their problem was that they live in a city or in a township. The township, they want to have chickens in their backyard.
Right.
For self-interest reasons. The price of eggs are expensive and they want to cut down on that price.
Right.
So there's an ordinance in town that says you can't have chickens. How would you deal with that in a situation where a constituent called in and asked?
Well, I mean, the first thing that would be most obvious is that we would look into the ordinance that says, okay, you can't do this, right? Is it outdated? Is it arbitrary? Is it specific in, I guess, how it's implemented? And we really look into the issue and see if we can really change it from there. That's kind of where sunset clauses come in. That was an earlier discussion that you and I had before.
I like sunset clauses.
I do too. And basically just checking a piece of legislation every now and again to see if it's still up to date, if it still works. And ultimately, our job is to make sure to ask the question, why can't this individual do it?
Okay.
And how can they get to that next step? And if there are others that disagree or they want the complete opposite, we don't want you to have that in your backyard or whatever.
Okay.
And we take everybody's interest into account.
Okay.
And essentially that goes through our whole process of testimony and yada yada yada.
So okay. Yep. All right. And we'll have time to kind of talk through each of those steps. You're talking about the policy process and doing the first of those three steps, the building, the formulating, and the adopting. And the formulation is really about digging into the issue that the constituent has raised the problem, right? Yep. So that's the building step.
Yep.
But the formulation then is where the legislator says, okay, I need to understand this problem, and then I want to understand the possible solutions. Yep. And in that process, you're thinking in the context of the constituent's self-interest. And then the collective, and I like that word collective, but when we think about the collective, it's not some amorphous blob, right?
Yeah.
The collective is actually made up of individuals who have their own interests, who then come together, and then truly in a true democratic process, majority rules, rule of law, they collectively say this is the law that we would like in terms of our civil society.
Right.
And then the individual comes in and says, well, I don't like what you've done collectively.
Right.
Well, our system is one where we do give deference to the individual interests taken together that says this is what the policy should be.
Yep.
And through a representative democracy, a constitutional representative democracy, we use our representatives to then represent the collective of the interest. And sometimes they may not necessarily be in line with what the majority of individuals want.
That's true.
That's what elections are for.
Absolutely.
Right? Okay.
Yeah.
So in answer to this question, again, how do you reconcile this self-interest with the idea of representative democracy and collective decision-making? We use elections.
Yep.
We take into consideration the individual's interest and then the collective interest of individuals.
Yep.
And then we ask the question, why? And it can't be arbitrary. It can't be because, right? That can't be the answer. Right. And if it is a because, then it can be challenged and it should be challenged. And you should think in that context of individual agency to challenge rules that you don't think are irrational or don't fit. That's one thing that we talked about on the books. And I don't want to belabor this, but the idea of something being on the books, and use the great term sunset clause.
Yeah.
The ability to pull things off of the books as laws, which are inhibiting to freedom,
Yep.
is as important as, in my opinion, putting laws on the books in the interest of the collective.
Yeah.
Right? I think the default should be laws coming off the books, or at least being reviewed, so they're not just sitting on the books to then become some arbitrary barrier for progress.
Yeah.
Right? So the person who comes and says, I'd like to have eggs in my backyard, what's their compelling argument?
Right.
Well, the cost of eggs is expensive,
Right.
right? Well, yeah, okay, but still, is that enough of an argument? It's an argument, and it is a good argument, right? But is it as good an argument to the neighbor who says, I just don't like chickens in the backyard
Right.
of people's houses?
Right. Yeah.
Right? And if that's the argument, and that may be the collective argument, to what degree does the individual's rights then hold out? Do we put as much weight to an individual argument that is logical and scientifically backed,
Right.
to the collective whose argument may just be because,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I do think that our system is one where, again, we use the courts, we have the rule of law.
Yep.
We have this concept of individual rights. This is why this is in the Declaration of Independence lecture.
Yep.
That our rights don't come from institutions or other individuals. Our rights come from God, in the context of self-agency and logic and reason and being rational. And as rational individuals, we should have the ability to debate and to argue our points.
Absolutely.
And just because our system is one, again, of representative democracy, a constitutional republic, just because the collective says we don't want you to do this, doesn't necessarily mean the individual should have to bend to the collective.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I think that that's how we would argue that, right? In terms of the collective is not some amorphous blob. It's made up of individuals with their interests.
Yep.
The individuals who make up the blob should be able to argue their interest and why there should be this law that stops an individual from exercising their interest.
Yep.
And we should always be constantly checking the laws on the books to make sure that they ultimately still apply. And that there's a formal process for doing this, where I do believe that we start in America, we start with the idea of a can do.
Yep.
That I can do it unless I'm told not to. All right. And that, but in the process of someone saying you cannot do something, then there has to be some law, some code or something that would keep them. And if we're going to change that law or change that code, that's where we go through our representative and do it through a formal process to get laws on the books.
Yeah. It's a two-way telephone.
Yeah.
So to speak. I mean, you can call your representative, but we also expect that constituents are going to call us with the problem instead of,
Sure.
going the wrong route.
Correct. And I think that that's a better method for representative democracy, that you're representing the interests of the individuals who call you. You're not trying to drive the community that you want. And that's we're getting into the argument of statesman versus the steward. But lastly, I just want to kind of touch on something that I thought we had a conversation about that should be reiterated. And that is, you work for a state legislator.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
State issues.
Yes.
Right? Not what's going on in Washington, D.C., whether it's getting rid of USAID or it's Doge and Elon Musk.
Yep.
That's not you.
Yep. No,
Right.
that's very important that I don't want to talk down to you guys, but you guys definitely need to remember that there's a difference between state, local, and federal.
Yeah.
And when you call your representative about a federal issue, Elon Musk, Doge, USAID, they're not going to have any push or pull because they represent the smaller communities, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger when you contact the right people. So if we get a call about those issues, it's hard to follow up on those.
All right. And it's important that when you think about, okay, how do we solve this problem of your individual interest or the collective interest? Is this a national issue, like a big institution issue, IRS, the Army, something like that, military, or is it a state issue, right? the cost of college tuition at Michigan State, or a local issue. My road's not getting plowed on a regular basis. There's a difference as to who you would reach out to and to try to address those
Yeah.
issues.
Big difference. And here's the thing: do some research into it because you're going to find some cool things. I mean, you're really going to find out some interesting aspects of both your local communities and your state communities.
Yeah, that's a good point. And we do that exercise in class where you actually will go through the task of of the steps to try to figure out who represents you. Sometimes it's just too easy though. You know what I mean? It's like I'm just going to call the first number that Google throws up at me, and then I'm just going to drop it at your feet.
Listen, we get those kinds of calls all the time.
But that's not a good way to actually get a solution.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Absolutely.
Okay. All right. I think we put this one to rest. I think again, individual versus the collective and reconciling the two is a recognition that the individual is the entity that's instilled with these rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then the collective is made up of various individuals, but they're all exercising their own individual interest. We have a rule of law, we have majority rules, but we also have a process that says, okay, you still have to make the argument. It cannot simply be because more people say because than this one person who gives a very compelling argument as to why.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Awesome. Beautiful.
All right. We'll do it again. Next question.
Cool.